The hum of the Bell 212 reverberated in the tight confines of the cockpit as Captain Sophia Kaine navigated through the narrow canyon walls. Below, the rugged terrain of Grey Rock Valley stretched endlessly, its harsh cliffs casting long shadows over the valley floor. She wasn't just flying through the air, she was threading a needle, guiding her aircraft between sheer rock faces that seemed close enough to touch. This wasn't a simple flight, it was a life-or-death race against time. In the back of her helicopter, a critically injured climber lay unconscious, his pulse weakening with each passing second. The medical technician in the rear cabin glanced up, his expression tight with worry. "Captain, his vitals are dropping fast. We need to get him to the trauma center in the next 20 minutes, or we'll lose." "Him," he called out, his voice edged with urgency. Sophia nodded but didn't respond. There was no time for words. Her grip tightened on the controls as she pushed the Bell 212 into a steep descent, the blades singing in protest as the helicopter sliced through the air. Her eyes flicked to the radar, watching the small green blip of her flight path on the screen. But something wasn't right. A warning flashed across the radar. "Warning: restricted military airspace. Unauthorized aircraft will be intercepted." Sophia's jaw tightened. She knew the risks. She had to make it through the narrowest part of the valley, and she needed to make it now. The route was dangerous under the best conditions. Today, with a dying man in her care and military airspace looming ahead, it felt impossible. Yet, she'd flown this route countless times before, though never under these conditions, never with the pressure of saving a life. This wasn't just a flight. It was a test of everything her father had taught. The radio crackled to life, the voice on the other end cold and official. "Unidentified civilian aircraft. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Land immediately or we will force you down." It was a Blackhawk pilot issuing an order, but it was an order that Sophia couldn't obey. Not now, not with a life hanging in the balance. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the transmission. Her focus was laser sharp. The sound of the Bell 212's rotor blades the only thing in her mind as she banked hard left, dodging the steep rock walls. The wind screamed through the canyon, rattling the old aircraft as Sophia pushed it harder. This was the only way she could get through. The only way she could make it to the trauma center in time. The Blackhawk was closing in fast. The lead aircraft, a sleek, modern military chopper, drew nearer, its sharp profile cutting through the air. From the cockpit, Sophia could see the Blackhawk in her rearview, its twin rotors spinning furiously. She could hear the tension in the Blackhawk pilot's voice as he gave his next. "Command, this is your final warning. Civilian, land now or we'll take action." Her heart raced, but there was no room for fear. There was only the task at hand, getting through this narrow canyon and saving the man's life. With a calm breath, Sophia tightened her grip on the controls and pushed the Bell 212 even harder, threading the aircraft between two massive rock faces that seemed to close in on her like a vice. The Blackhawk pilot's voice echoed again, this time laced with disbelief. How is she keeping up with us? The question was more for himself than anyone else. In their sleek, advanced military helicopters, the Blackhawks were more than capable of outmaneuvering any civilian aircraft. But they weren't prepared for the instincts of someone like Sophia. Sophia could feel the helicopter's vibrations, each shift in the wind, every small adjustment in the air currents. This was her territory, her father's legacy. She wasn't just flying the Bell 212, she was part of it. She could feel its every movement, its every reaction to the gusts of wind as she maneuvered it through the deadly canyon. The radio crackled again, the voice now filled with a mix of irritation and disbelief. How is she even keeping up? Her bird's so old. It belongs in a museum. We should be able to force her down easily. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning the canyon ahead. She had heard similar comments about her aircraft, comments that didn't bother her but fueled her resolve to prove them wrong. But even as the Blackhawks drew closer, their pursuit more aggressive, Sophia's determination only grew stronger. They thought she was just another reckless civilian pilot. They had no idea that they were chasing the daughter of Colonel Richard Kaine, the legendary commander of Viper Talon, one of the most respected military units in the history of special operations, aviation. They had no idea who they were really chasing. She pushed the Bell 212 harder, her movements smooth and practiced, instinctively knowing what the aircraft needed before it even shifted. The Blackhawks were closing in on her, but Sophia wasn't afraid. In fact, she wasn't even worried. She was doing exactly what her father had taught her. But in that moment, as she banked sharply through a particularly treacherous part of the canyon, she felt it, the sudden shift in the air, the subtle change in the vibration of the aircraft. Something had changed. The Blackhawks were no longer just chasing her. They were about to find out exactly who she was. Sophia's thoughts drifted back to the days of her childhood, to the echoes of her father's voice and the steady rhythm of the Bell 212. She remembered watching him meticulously work on his aircraft, his movements deliberate, measured everything he did had a purpose. Colonel Richard Kaine, the legendary commander of the Viper Talon unit, had been a force of nature. Known for his unparalleled flying skills and unshakable calm under pressure, he had shaped an entire generation of pilots. He wasn't just a hero in the air, he was a living legend, feared and respected by both enemies and allies alike. The stories of Viper Talon and their impossible maneuvers through enemy territory were whispered in military circles, where every move had been a carefully crafted work of art. Sophia had grown up hearing them, seeing his name written in the history books, but always as an outsider, never directly a part of it. Her memories were woven with images of her father, a man who rarely spoke of his past but whose presence was larger than life. As a child, Sophia was drawn to the cockpit like a moth to a flame. It wasn't long before she was sitting at his side, absorbing every detail, every command, but more than the mechanics of flight. It was the silent lessons that stuck with her. Flying isn't just about the instruments, it's about feeling the air currents, knowing what your bird needs before it even moves. Her father had once told her. His teachings weren't confined to flight manuals or training sessions, they were lessons passed down through the bloodline. Yet, there was always the underlying pressure of living up to his legacy, of meeting the impossible standards that he had set for himself and his team. The Bell 212, though old and weathered, had always been a symbol of her father's legacy. Its body was marked by the scars of countless missions, each scratch and dent a reminder of the years it had spent in the service of men who flew it like extensions of themselves. For Sophia, this helicopter was more than just a machine. It was a piece of history, a connection to the man who had defined her childhood. She remembered the first time she had flown it alone, the weight of the controls feeling like her father's hand guiding her through. The motions, his voice echoed in her mind as she took the stick. Flying isn't just a skill, it's an instinct. You've got it in you, Sophia. You just have to trust it. Her desire to fly had never been about escaping her father's shadow, it was about making sure that the shadow was cast in a way that was worthy of the man who had been a living legend. The Viper Talon Squadron was one of the most elite military units in history, renowned for its advanced aerial tactics. Their missions were not just about flying, they were about mastering the impossible. The pilots of Viper Talon weren't just soldiers, they were artists, using aircraft as tools to bend the laws of aviation. Her father had been their maestro, orchestrating intricate formations and aerial maneuvers that could outwit the most sophisticated enemy forces. But with his reputation came the impossible expectation for his daughter to fill shoes far too large. The stories Sophia grew up with weren't just of Viper Talon's triumphs in combat, they were of the men who had fought beside her father, who had respected him as a mentor, as a leader, as a legend. There was pride in those stories, but there was also a burden. She wasn't just trying to follow in her father's footsteps, she was trying to carry the weight of his name into a world that didn't know him the way she did. She wasn't just a daughter anymore, she was Captain Sophia Kaine, a name that was starting to stand on its own. But every time she looked at the faded insignia on her Bell 212, she couldn't escape the question, was she worthy of the legacy? Was she the one who could continue the tradition? Or would she be another footnote in the long history of Viper Talon? In her quiet moments, when the helicopter hummed steadily through the sky, she could still hear her father's voice, as clear as it had been in the cockpit years ago. Some things aren't passed down on paper. Sophia, they're in your blood. She had heard him say it so many times that it became a mantra, one that lived in her bones now, as she pushed herself to the limits of her abilities. Her entire life had been a dance between wanting to prove herself as more than just his daughter and knowing that, deep down, she carried the same instincts he had once honed in the most dangerous skies. But Sophia also knew that the legacy she carried wasn't just about proving herself. It was about understanding that the true measure of her worth wasn't in mimicking her father's every move. It was about finding her own place in the sky, creating her own legacy, and proving that she was capable of taking on the mantle in a way that was uniquely hers. She wasn't just trying to fly like him, she was flying because of him. The lessons she had learned from him would be her guide, but the path she walked would be her own. The air inside the cockpit was thick with the hum of the aging Bell 212 as it threaded its way through Grey Rock Valley, a place known for its treacherous terrain. Captain Sophia Kaine could feel the pressure mounting, both from the weight of the mission and the growing danger around her. She had flown this path countless times before, but never under these conditions. A critically injured mountain climber was lying unconscious in the back, his vital signs weak and rapidly deteriorating. The urgency was real, and time was slipping away. She needed to get him to the trauma center in less than 20 minutes, or he would die. But with every second that passed, the situation became more complicated. Sophia knew the valley well too well. It was a route that most pilots avoided. The sharp turns, sudden drops, and narrow gaps between rock walls made it a nightmare for even the most experienced aviators. But Sophia wasn't like the other pilots. She was Richard Kaine's daughter, and the bloodline that ran through her veins was one of tactical precision, legendary flying techniques, and an unwavering belief in her skills. As the helicopter descended lower, Sophia's hands gripped the controls with practiced ease. Every movement was deliberate, instinctive. She could feel the aircraft's response to the shifting winds and rocky terrain, an extension of herself, just like her father had always said. Flying isn't just about the aircraft, it's about understanding it, knowing how it responds to the environment, to the air currents, to your touch. Masmar, he had told her many times. This was her inheritance, her legacy. The precision flying that had made Viper Talon legendary was in her bones. She was carrying it forward, not just as a pilot, but as the next link in a long chain of aviators who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the sky. The Blackhawk helicopters behind her, part of the military's attempt to intercept her, were closing in. Sophia didn't need to look to know they were there. Their heavy, menacing silhouettes were etched into her mind. They had already warned her to land, but that was never an option. Not while the life of the climber hung in the balance. She wasn't about to let them stop her, and she certainly wasn't going to explain herself. Time was the enemy, and the Blackhawks were just another obstacle in her way. The canyon walls loomed ahead, and Sophia's focus sharpened. She was approaching the tightest section of the valley, where the walls came within a mere 50 feet of each other. The maneuver required more than just technical skill. It required a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the aircraft. As she navigated the gap, she could hear the sound of the rotor blades cutting through the air, a symphony of mechanical precision. Her heart pounded, but she was steady, calm. She had no room for doubt, no time for fear. The patient's life depended on her. The Blackhawks were closing faster now, their movements synchronized as they tried to corner her. They had the speed, the power, and the weaponry to take her down. But they didn't have the instinct, the deep connection between pilot and machine that Sophia inherited from her father. Her Bell 212 may have been old, but it was part of her family's legacy, and she would push it to its absolute limits to complete this mission. Sophia banked sharply to the left, squeezing through a narrow gap in the canyon that would have been impossible for any other pilot to navigate. The Blackhawks tried to follow, but they couldn't match her precision. They pulled back, their hesitation giving Sophia a split-second advantage. She used that time to accelerate, diving lower into the canyon, threading her aircraft between the jagged rocks as if she were a part of the landscape. The Bell 212 responded like an old friend, knowing exactly what she wanted, when she wanted it. The radio crackled again, but this time the tone was different. There was more urgency now, and Sophia could hear the frustration in the Blackhawk pilot's voice. Unidentified civilian aircraft, you are endangering lives. Land immediately or we will take action. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Every second spent talking was a second lost in the race to save the climber's life. Her eyes scanned the valley ahead, calculating every maneuver in her head as the Blackhawks closed in once again. Sophia could feel the tension building in her body, her muscles tight with the effort of keeping the Bell 212 steady through the constant wind shifts and the rocky obstacles in her path. The Blackhawks were relentless, closing in from different angles, but she was relentless too. She was determined to save that man, to push through the danger and complete her mission. But she was also aware of the growing toll on her aircraft, the way the rotor blades strained under the pressure of the high-speed maneuvering. There was no turning back now. She would fly through this valley, through the storm, and save this life or die trying. With one final surge of effort, she pulled the Bell 212 through a hairpin turn, the aircraft scraping dangerously close to the canyon wall. The Blackhawks had to pull back again, their formations breaking as they were forced to avoid the same sharp rock faces that Sophia used to her advantage. She was in the clear, but only for a moment. The military was still hot on her trail, and Sophia's fight was far from over. Behind her, the medical technician checked the patient's vitals once again. "Captain, his blood pressure is dropping. We're running out of time." The urgency in his voice only added to the pressure weighing on Sophia's shoulders. But she wasn't about to give up. She had come too far to fail now. She could see the faint outline of the trauma center in the distance. The runway just ahead. It would be close, but she was going to make it. As she navigated the final stretch, Sophia pushed the Bell 212 even harder. Every movement calculated, every instinct in sync with the machine. The Blackhawks, though still in pursuit, were no longer a threat. They had given up the chase. Their role now simply to clear the path for her final descent. They were following her, yes, but they were following a legend, and they knew it. Sophia guided the Bell 212 onto the final approach path to the trauma center. She could hear the roar of the Blackhawks in the distance, circling above her like a protective shield. Her heart raced, but her hands remained steady on the controls. The patient in the back was alive, for now. She had done it. She had overcome the valley, the Blackhawks, and the relentless ticking of the clock. As the Blackhawk helicopters closed in on Captain Sophia Kaine, a strange shift occurred in the air, a change that rippled through the pursuit. Like a sudden gust of wind, the lead Blackhawk pilot, Major Derek Evans, who had been issuing warnings over the radio, felt a chill run down his spine as he took a closer look at the fading emblem. On Sophia's Bell 212, the weathered insignia, the distinctive Viper Talon Cobra with wings, was unmistakable. For a moment, the air seemed to freeze, and the chase that had been so aggressive and relentless slowed. Major Evans' eyes widened in disbelief as the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some reckless civilian pilot. This was the daughter of Colonel Richard Kaine, the man who had led Viper Talon to legendary status. The Blackhawk formation immediately began to adjust. The tone of their communication shifted, no longer filled with the urgency and aggression of a chase, but something deeper, something almost reverent. Captain Sophia Kaine wasn't just any pilot. She was carrying a legacy, a name that had been buried under layers of classified information. But a name nonetheless. The world might have forgotten, but the military pilots who had trained under the banner of Viper Talon would never forget. The insignia on her aircraft spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't just a mark of her father's unit. It was a symbol of excellence, of history, and of untold feats in the air. Sophia, her concentration absolute, noticed the shift in the Blackhawks' movements. They no longer closed in to force her down. Instead, they began to fall back, widening their formation as they adjusted their approach. It was subtle at first, but to someone who had grown up in the shadows of military legends, the change was palpable. They were no longer pursuing her. They were watching her. Respect was slowly seeping into their actions. The harsh, arrogant chatter over the radio stopped, replaced with a stunned silence. Behind Major Evans, one of the other Blackhawk pilots spoke up, his voice dripping with awe and recognition. Is that really the Viper Talon insignia? His voice faltered as he said it, as if the very mention of the legendary unit brought with it a weight of unspoken history. Major Evans didn't need to answer. He already knew the answer. And it was more than just a symbol, it was a living legacy. The Viper Talon Squadron was not just a chapter in military aviation, it was a legend in its own right, revered for its skill, precision, and the men who had flown under its banner. Richard Kaine had been the heart of it all, and now, standing before them, was his daughter. Evans's mind raced back to his early days as a young lieutenant in flight school. He remembered Sergeant Morrison, a veteran who had taught him to fly and had once pulled him aside during a particularly difficult exercise. Morrison had said, "If you ever see a cobra with wings in the sky, you don't engage, you don't challenge it, you just watch, because that's the purest form of flying you'll ever witness." Evans had asked what he meant, but Morrison's only response was a knowing glance, as if the answer was something one had to experience to understand. Now, looking at the aircraft ahead of him, the truth of Morrison's words hit him with undeniable clarity. This wasn't just a flight, this was history. The entire formation of Blackhawks seemed to recognize the significance of the moment, even if they hadn't fully processed the history behind it. They were watching Sophia, and they were watching her with the reverence that only those who had been part of Viper Talon could truly understand. The Bell 212, though outdated and weathered, had become more than just a helicopter. It was a symbol, a living, breathing connection to the past. Evans's voice came through the radio, tinged with something far more respectful than before. Break formation. All units. Break formation. His command was firm but laced with awe. That's Viper Talon's emblem. That's Kaine's bird. The Blackhawk pilots followed his orders without question, their sleek helicopters gradually pulling away. The chase had ended, but what followed was a quiet, respectful distance that only grew as they continued to circle above, keeping watch. The military might have expected to encounter a rogue pilot, but they had stumbled upon something far greater, a connection to the very essence of their own aviation history. Major Evans wasn't sure what to do next, but instinctively, he knew that his role had changed. His mission wasn't to force down a civilian pilot. It was to protect and respect a living legacy, one that commanded far more than just compliance. Sophia, still flying with practiced precision, could feel the change in the air as the Blackhawks peeled off. They were no longer threats, they were guardians of the skies, giving her space to complete her mission. The chase had turned into an escort, and Sophia, despite the danger that still loomed in the shadows, allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible breath of relief. Her father's legacy had not only been recognized, but had altered the course of her path in the skies. The weight of it was almost overwhelming, but it also fueled her resolve. She was no longer just flying to save a life, she was flying to uphold a name, a family, and a tradition that had once been legendary. As the formation of Blackhawks maintained their respectful distance, the radio buzzed again. But this time, it was a voice that commanded respect, a voice that knew the history of the Kaine family, of Viper Talon, and the man who had shaped it. "Sophia," the voice of General Morrison said over the secure line, her tone steady and filled with reverence. "You're not just carrying a patient to safety, you're carrying a legacy. Your father would be proud of you." Sophia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words were enough. They told her that the legend of Richard Kaine, and now, the legend of Sophia Kaine, was still very much alive in the skies above them. She wasn't alone. For the first time in years, she realized she didn't have to prove herself. Her name was her legacy, and it was being respected by those who knew what it truly meant. As the weeks passed, Captain Sophia Kaine stood before a new generation of military pilots at Grey Rock Air Base, ready to pass on the lessons she had inherited from her father, Colonel Richard Kaine. It was a moment that had taken years to reach, but now, standing in front of the classroom full of eager eyes, she realized that she was no longer just Richard Kaine's daughter. She had carved out a legacy of her own. She was no longer in his shadow. She had become a legend in her own right. Her father's name had carried her far, but now, it was her skill, her bravery, and her understanding of what it meant to fly that would define her place in history. Sophia had always known that being the daughter of Viper Talon's leader was a blessing and a curse. She had lived under the immense pressure of his reputation, trying to live up to something that seemed impossible to follow. But now, as she stood before the group of young pilots, she realized that the greatest gift her father had ever given her wasn't just his name, but the mindset he had instilled in her, the unwavering belief that nothing was impossible if you had the courage to push beyond your limits. Flying is not just about following the rules or executing textbook maneuvers, i.e., she told the class, her voice steady, filled with authority. It's about knowing when to push those boundaries, to trust your instincts, and to break through when everything around you tells you to stop. She paused, her eyes scanning the faces of the young pilots who hung on every word. These weren't just lessons from a manual. These were lessons of heart, of soul, passed down from one generation to the next. The class wasn't just about technical skill, it was about courage, determination, and above all, legacy. As she spoke, her thoughts drifted back to her father. She could still remember the early days, when she was just a child, sitting in the cockpit of his Bell 212 learning the feel of the aircraft, the rhythms of flight. Her father had never been a man of many words, but his presence had always spoken volumes. The lessons he taught her weren't the kind you found in textbooks. They were learned through experience, through the feeling of the wind against your face and the hum of the engines beneath you. Every move, every maneuver had a purpose, and that purpose was to never give up, no matter how difficult the challenge. It was that spirit that she now carried with her as she looked out over the room. One of the young pilots, eager and full of questions, raised his hand. "Captain, how do we know when it's time to break the rules? When do we push beyond the limits?" The question hung in the air, the tension palpable. Sophia smiled, her father's words echoing in her mind. "You'll know, because your heart will tell you that a human life is worth more than any safety margin." She turned to the class, meeting their eyes one by one. "You'll know," she said softly, "because in the moment, when everything is on the line, you'll feel it. Your aircraft doesn't know limitations. It's the pilot who creates them." She could see the understanding in their eyes. They were beginning to grasp what she meant, not just about flying, but about life itself. The courage to exceed what you thought was possible, to take a leap of faith when everything told you to stay grounded. Sophia continued, her voice strong and unwavering. "When you fly, you are not just operating a machine. You become one with it. The aircraft becomes part of you, and you become part of the aircraft. You'll know when to push, when to pull back, and when to trust that your instincts will guide you through the most difficult moments. She could see the fire igniting in their eyes. These young pilots were ready. They weren't just learning how to fly, they were learning how to honor the legacy of Viper Talon, a legacy that wasn't just about military might, but about the art of flying. At the end of the class, as the students filed out, a few lingered behind, their questions still bubbling to the surface. Sophia stood by the window, looking out at the runway where her Bell 212 stood, its once weathered body now polished and gleaming under the setting sun. It had been a long journey from the cockpit of her father's helicopter to standing here today, teaching these young pilots what it truly meant to fly. But the journey had shaped her. It had made her realize that her father's legacy wasn't just about the aircraft or the missions. It was about the mindset, the determination, and the belief that nothing was impossible. She climbed into her Bell 212 one last time that evening, flying it through the now familiar route over Grey Rock Valley. As the helicopter soared through the canyon, she felt a deep connection to her father's spirit, a connection that had always been with her, but one she had never fully understood until now. She wasn't just flying in his footsteps, she was flying in her own right, carrying forward the lessons he had taught her. The valley that once felt so intimidating now felt like home, like a place where she could truly honor the legacy of Viper Talon. The sky above was clear, the wind gentle, and for the first time in a long time, Sophia allowed herself a moment of peace. She wasn't just Colonel Richard Kaine's daughter anymore. She was Captain Sophia Kaine, and her legacy was only just beginning.